Welcome. What we will do in this demonstration is to see how we can have a nice, simple, pleasing landscape using pine trees in a distance. So essentially, in another demonstration, we saw how we can have a very nice landscapes just by having these trees in the distance. So these are very simple landscape. We essentially start by drawing few trees in the distance, and these are very small, nice, really nice, pleasing landscapes. And what I want to show now is how we can have a similar landscape, but we will use pine trees instead. So again, what we will do is we'll start by kind of putting down the pine trees in the distance. And in other demonstration, we saw how the pine trees are drawn in the distance. So essentially, what you do is you lay down a line, and this kind of indicates the main trunk and the line of the pine tree. And then what you do, you just start by you can, if you want, you can even create like a tape or something like this, and then you use these needle strokes. Essentially, create a feel of foliage, needle foliage for the pine trees in the distance. So this is the kind of small kind of grassy stroke that we have seen in other demonstrations, but in a very small a needle feel like this, and that's what you use to give a feel of needle for the pine trees. So that's what we essentially do to create a pine tree in a distance. So essentially draw a line that represents the height of the tree, and then you start to kind of add these kind of needles to give the shape of this tree. And essentially this needles this brings out the pine foliage, the needle foliage for this pine tree. So this is how easy it is essentially to create the pine tree. So essentially when you're using a deciduous foliage tree, then we're essentially using this kind of shape, and then we're using these parallel lines to bring out the texture that we have seen in the demonstration. But for pine, essentially we use a different approach where we draw the line that represents its center, and then essentially add these needles, and you always leave a bit of trunk showing through over here, something like this, right? So there we have it. So this is how you can draw a pine tree at a distance. And what you do at the end is to kind of again create a bit of tonal variation in the needle foliage. So essentially whenever you have any kind of tree foliage, for the deciduous trees, we essentially use a set of parallel lines, something like this, right, to create a bit of different tones in the foliage that gives a depth to the foliage. And what we will do for the pine trees to essentially add a bit more needles near the center around here. So essentially what you want to show is that there's a bit of darker foliage, more foliage near the center, and it gets lighter towards the edges. So this creates a nice feel of volume in the pine tree. So this is how you can essentially draw a kind of a pine tree in the distance. And what we will do essentially is to draw a simple nice composition where we have a group of these in the distance. So essentially in other landscapes we have seen how you can actually draw these pine trees up close and in the distance. So that's that's one option. But sometimes you just want to create a very simple pleasing landscape quickly, and just drawing these trees at the distance is a great way of doing it, because essentially when you're drawing at a distance you have to draw far less needles. So essentially at a distance the trees are smaller, so you just essentially have to draw a lot less of a needle, and it can be done quickly. And when we'll see in the end that that the landscapes are very pleasing, because essentially they still have a sense of distance and our eyes are drawn to those trees. So that's what we're doing in this landscape. So essentially kind of just have a bunch of pine trees in the distance, and then we will have a nice backdrop or a nice path that leads up to them. So there we have it. So I just added another pine tree, and again in the end what you can do is to just at the edges you can just use a dot or something, even something like this, just to add a bit of open airy feel. So always remember that in any kind of tree foliage you need to have an open airy feel. So when you have a draw like this, do not go in a very fixed order like this, and do not never use these hard lines for the foliage, because these hard lines will kill the effect of the foliage. So you always have to use, when you're using this deciduous, use these lines, parallel lines, and then at the edges you can also add a loop, something like this that we have seen in other demonstrations, to create a nice open airy feel. And for the pine trees, you can even use a dot or something like this, just to reinforce that open airy feel at the edges. So there we have it, right? So there's something like this. And you can also add a bit of kind of a small branch that is visible, but most likely since our pine tree is at a distance, these branches won't be visible, so you can leave them out. So there we have it. So second pine tree that we drew. And what I always do is to draw the trees where the foliage is in the front, so in a sense that are closest to the viewer. So essentially in this composition we don't really have any pine trees that are very close to the viewer. So essentially if we have pine trees very close, then we would start by drawing something like this, but they're all in the distance. But still you have to draw the trees where the foliage is completely visible, in a sense that are closest first. And once you have done that, then you can draw the other pine trees that are kind of hidden behind it. So let me just draw one more over here. So these are the 3 pine trees over here that we have. And then what we will do is essentially is to then draw some other pine trees where that are a bit hidden behind them. So I again start by adding this needle foliage over here, something like this. So as you can see, I'm again using this, this dots, and there's a bit of line, something like this, right? So I'm not, sometimes there is a, sometimes you feel like just, using something like this, like, doing a bit of darkness with your pen. So avoid that temptation, because what happens is that the moment you have that kind of solid darkness, that takes away the feel of the foliage, that takes away the feel of needle. So you have to always kind of just keep moving your pen and add a bit of needle here and needle there, and then soon you have a nice tonal variation, a bit of darkness. But this darkness is achieved using the needles only. So that's the main difference, is that you can still see there is some variation. Our eyes can still detect that it is not a solid darkness, something like this, but there is a small variation in that tone, and that really helps to kind of give them a feel of foliage, a needle, versus just having a dark shape, something like this. So once we have these three main trees, what I will do is I will just simply add a bit of more pine trees in the distance. And what you do essentially is that you just add foliage that will be visible. So essentially over here, when we have two pine trees, then the foliage will only be visible over here. So that's what we do essentially. We just add a foliage over here, and what happens is that our mind is able to interpret that this pine tree is at the distance, is further behind, because what you have is this foliage coming through over here, and then essentially you have this kind of foliage that is kind of hidden behind. So it's great, our mind is great at kind of interpreting things, and what you have to do is to just take advantage of it. So we do not want to, again, you do not want to draw the full foliage for this tree at the back, because that will kind of confuse our mind. So for any tree that is behind, what you do is then you draw the top, make it darker, and then this dark contrasts with the light over here and here. So essentially that's why when we have a pine tree, the edges, this area is lighter, this area is lighter, and then when you will have another pine tree at the back, you make the top darker, but this area, that is left lighter. So now we can see that there is visual separation, and our mind is able to kind of interpret the relative order of the trees. And I'll do something similar over here. So for example, I will again just draw this, and then I will add my needles over here, right? So what will happen is that as I approach this area, I will kind of keep that separation from the needles in the front. So yeah, so I do not try to overlap the needles. And what you can also do is to make the foliage, the needles at the back, a bit darker, so that creates a nice visual separation. So there we have it, right? So what I can do is I can even add a bit more to the front, and then so there we have it. So now what I've done is, there's this black kind of, area that is kind of, defining the needle for the back. And then we have the lighter area over here that is defining the, the needles for the front pine tree. So this is something that you have to keep in mind and use to kind of create that relative order. So the placing of the trunk defines the relative order, right? So this trunk is more closer. This is kind of in our horizon line, or a line in the distance. So the trunk that are closer to this line will be kind of further away. So this trunk is further out than this and this, but you have to reinforce that with the foliage as well. So that's what I've done over here, is that just I've made the foliage a bit darker, and these lighter areas, I do not kind of overimpose the foliage of the different trees. So essentially now we have darker area and the lighter areas. The lighter areas are for the trees in the front at the edges, and the darker areas for the tree in the back, more towards the center. So this is how you can establish a relative order of the pine trees and reinforce it with your pine foliage as well. And what I will do is again I can have one more pine tree with the full foliage showing through over here, and then have a few more trees here and there. So this is again a very simple composition that we saw last in other demonstration. I drew it with our deciduous trees, and here you can use the pine trees. But this is this real fun drawing to do. It's very simple and very small, small in size. So essentially it's just it's just the width is 1.5 to 2 inches, and then your you can make it as long as you want, but something like 3 or 4 inches. So this is a small drawing, but it's a very pleasing landscape. Essentially you can do it anytime, and this really provides a kind of nice relaxation. And then there's infinite varieties you can have on this theme. So essentially you can have different pine trees of different sizes oriented differently, and then you can have different other elements here and there, right? So if you want, you can make the pine trees a bit inside, and then have like a mountain at the back, or some kind of small hill, or a lot of other possibilities that you can use with this composition. So this is a nice simple composition. And again here I drew a pine tree, and again as you can see towards the edges over here I leave it a bit light. So if you want, you can add a bit more dot just to bring out that lightness, right? So we have this pine tree, and then I will again add one over here, something like this. And if you want, you can even kind of put small dots just to kind of show the shape of the pine tree. So this is the shape that we will have for this pine tree at the back. And over here, so as you can see, this is the kind of area that where I will make the needles a bit darker, and then we'll have the light edges of this trees in the front over there. So that's what I will do. So I'll go ahead and then again just add a bit of, so to make the darker areas, just add more of that needle. So again, you do not use a darker spot, but more of these needles, because what happens is that even in the darker areas, there is a bit of texture that our eyes can detect. So just when you're using the needles like this, you create a kind of a darker texture that indicates the needle, compared to this hard dark that doesn't indicate that. So this is what you always have to keep in mind, is to just use the needle to create the dark texture. So there we have it. So now again, what I did was to kind of create in this kind of space a bit of darker texture for the tree that is at the back, and then we have the lighter areas over here on the edges. And what I will do is I will simply add in a few more trees towards the edges as well. Just a bit over here, a bit over there, something like this. So this is one over here, and then I can add, and then the other thing you can do is to simply add a trunk showing through over here. So you don't really have to add even the needle, because you don't really have space available. But just by adding these trunks, indicate that there is something at the distance, and gives it a bit more feel of the wooded feel, that is more interesting. And if you want, you can add a bit of foliage at the very bottom just to indicate something over there. This way, I just one trunk over here, and if I want to add a bit more wooded feel, again I add one more trunk over here. So as you can see, these different trunks are giving a nice feel of a density of pine trees in the distance. And I also try to make these trunks at different distances, so I'm not putting them in the same line, but slightly kind of up and below, so that creates a bit of visual interest over there. So something like this, right? And if I want, I can even add one more over here, and then add a bit of needle at the bottom, something like this. So there we have it. And again, as you can see, there's a bit more white over here. So again, I go ahead and add a bit of line over there, something like this. So just by adding a bit of tapered, and also remember this is a tapered line, something like this. So just by adding a bit of tapered line, creates a nice feel of density of trees in the distance. And we saw again this with other demonstration where we used deciduous trees. Just by adding these lines, create a nice visual interest. And again, you don't have to do it uniformly. So if you want, you can leave the edges a bit lighter on the trees and make the density a bit more in the center. So something like this. So now we have nice feel of more density of trees over here, because we have more of these trunk lines, and at the edges we have less of it. So this is a simple nice composition, and you can play with it. And if you want, you can add more trees and something like that. And what we will do in the end is just have a bit of grass on the ground, just to make the ground interesting. And again, what you do is you simply use this kind of grass stroke over here. So I'll simply add a bit of this grass stroke just to ground the trunks. And again, what you do to ground the trunk is to add a bit of a bit of darkness to the bottom, something like this. So what you do is essentially use these very small strokes, and since the trunks are very small, what you can even do is just add a bit of dot, a bit of very small lines, something like this, then add a bit of darkness to the base of the trunk, and that is how those trunks are grounded. And over here, I can even add a bit of this dry branches. So essentially, in pine trees, the bottom of the tree usually have a bit of this kind of dry branches, so you can even draw that, but just only draw it on the tree that is up close, because for the far out trees that won't be visible. And again, I go ahead and add a bit of grass over here, a bit of grass over there, something like this, just to ground these trunks. There we have it. So this is how grounding the trunks serves to kind of have a finished feel for the drawing. And what you do is simply add a bit of darkness like this just to ground them, and there we have it. And then if you want, you can stop at this point, or the other thing you can do is to even create a bit of ground so that the eyes can travel. And the way you do it is by creating this ground form. So essentially what you do is you create these parallel lines that creates the ground form, something like this. What I'm doing here is I'm not uniformly covering the ground with these lines, but also creating a path in between. So if you have a bunch of line here and another set of line here, then what will happen is that this white will be seen as a kind of an worn out path by our eyes. So that's what I'm doing. I'm essentially adding a bit line over here. So this creates a ground form, and the white in between serves to serves as a kind of path that eyes can travel as well. And then what I will do finally in the end is to simply add a bit of dots, or an indication of grass on this path, something like this over here. Something like this. So what is now happening is that we are having a nice definition of a path leading towards that dense pine wooded area. And that also that's always more interesting in a composition. So something, if you just leave it white over here, that doesn't seem so interesting compared to just adding a bit of this definition of path using these lines, and then a bit of grass as a ground cover over there. And if you want, you can add a bit of dots, or sometimes very small grass on the white spot, just to give it a bit more definition, something like this. And there we have it. It's nice simple composition we put together in under 20 minutes. And again, this is a very very versatile composition. So essentially, you simply draw pine trees in the distance, and you can change the definite the composition by having more towards more, or you can have them more closer, and you can have some other elements showing up as well. So for example, here I feel that there's a bit something missing on the edge. So what I can do, I can simply add one more pine tree over here. Yeah. So this is something that you can play with, and soon you will have a feel for when you feel that there's a nice balance. So essentially, balance is a big concept in any landscapes, that you need to have kind of balance of trees, and that's something that that you will get with practice. So for example, here now I feel that my composition is a bit balanced because it has a bigger tree a bit closer, and then it's something a smaller tree far out in the distance. So I always try to have the tree at the edges far out in the distance. That creates a nice feel, and that's what I did over here. Then I can again just ground that and just add a bit of grass. The other thing you can do also is that in other compositions we have seen that if we have space over here in the backdrop, then we have used these parallel lines like this to create a distant foliage and other things, and like a mountain. But since we really don't have space over here to do anything, what you can do is to simply add a bit of dot over there like this. So that indicates something in the distance. Essentially, I can even just add a bit of dot like this. Try not to lose these trunks. So you don't want to kind of your dots kind of messing and interfering with this trunk definition. But even over here at the base, you just add a bit of dot. So what happens is, just by adding a bit of dot like in between gently, it gives us some hint of something at the back. So essentially, white showing through it, at least to me, feels that that there's something is missing. So essentially what you want to do is to give a bit hint of something at the back, maybe more pine trees or maybe some other kind of foliage, and just adding a bit of dot right over there in this in that very faint white spot helps you give that indication. So these dots these are great at kind of suggesting. So these are not small dot like this, but little bit so just like this. So these are great at suggesting something in the distance, so when you have very less space, just use them very effectively. But remember not to lose your pine these trunks definition in the process. And then if you want, you can just darken the base a little bit over here and add a bit of more dot just to give a bit more kind of nice feel to the distance. So over here, just by adding a bit more dot, what I'm giving is a more suggestion to the mind of viewer, as there's something over there, and that adds more interest. So there we have it. Just by adding a bit more dots, now we have a nice feel for something in the distance. And then we have also this nice definition of this ground form and these paths leading us to the distance. And I can just add a bit more grass over here, a bit more grass over there, and there we have it in a nice simple composition we put together. And again, this is a very versatile composition that you can adapt in many different ways and enjoy doing it anytime. And just once again, what I can do is just at the end just add a bit more over here. So you don't want to have any kind of big white spots in your pine foliage. So if you see some white spots that are a bit more, then you can just add a bit of dots here and there. So there we have it. So here, so this is something we put together in under 20 minutes, and yeah, something you can enjoy doing anytime. Thanks. Take care. Bye bye.